Picture this: a room filled with the wealthiest people in the country, crystal chandeliers hanging overhead, champagne flowing like water, laughter echoing off marble walls, politicians, CEOs, old money, new money, everyone who mattered was there. And then, in the middle of it all, a woman in a simple black uniform did something no one in that room could have ever imagined. She walked up to her billionaire boss, looked him dead in the eye, and slapped him across the face. Hard. The sound cut through the music like a gunshot. The room went silent. Every conversation stopped. Every glass froze mid-air. And for a moment, the most powerful man in the room just stood there, stunned, his cheek red, his expression unreadable. Everyone expected her to be dragged out, arrested, destroyed. But what he did next? It changed everything. Because this wasn't just about a slap. It was about a secret so dark, so buried, that when it finally came to light, it didn't just ruin reputations. It shattered lives. Stay with me, because what you're about to hear isn't fiction. It's based on a real story that happened behind closed doors, in a world where power protects the guilty and silence buries the truth. And by the end of this, you'll be asking yourself one question. If you were in her shoes, would you have done the same? So let's start with the obvious. Who was this woman? And why would someone risk everything, her job, her safety, maybe even her life, to humiliate one of the most powerful men in the country in front of everyone he knew? Was it revenge? Was it desperation? Or was it something much deeper? Something that had been building for years, quietly, invisibly, until it finally exploded in that one moment. And here's the part that'll make your skin crawl. The billionaire didn't press charges. He didn't fire her. He didn't even raise his voice. Instead, he looked at her, and after a long, heavy silence, he told his security to back off. Then he smiled. Not a warm smile, not a kind smile. A smile that said he knew something no one else in that room did. Because this wasn't an accident, and it wasn't impulsive. It was planned. And the reason why? That's the story you're about to hear. Let me introduce you to the two people at the center of this story. First, there's the maid. Let's call her Elena. Elena Carter. She was 43 years old, originally from a small town in Ohio, and she'd been working as a housekeeper for nearly 6 years in the estate of one of the richest men in America. She was quiet, polite, the kind of person who blended into the background so well that people barely noticed she was there. She'd take the early bus every morning, arriving before sunrise to clean rooms that were bigger than most people's entire homes. She'd scrub floors, dust chandeliers, fold towels with perfect corners, and disappear before the family even woke up. No one really knew much about her. She didn't talk about her life. She didn't complain. She just worked. But here's the thing about people like Elena. They see everything. They hear everything. And they remember everything. Over the years, she'd overheard phone calls that weren't meant for anyone's ears. She'd seen documents left carelessly on desks. She'd watched deals being made, lives being bought, reputations being buried. And she kept it all to herself, because that's what people in her position do. They survive by staying silent, but silence has a breaking point. Now let's talk about him, Richard Hale, 58 years old, self-made billionaire. Started with nothing, built an empire in real estate and private equity, became a household name. You've probably seen his face on magazine covers. Time, Forbes, Fast Company, the man who turned ambition into billions. On paper, he was a success story, the kind of guy politicians wanted to be seen with, the kind of guy charities begged to write checks, the kind of guy who smiled for the cameras and shook hands with presidents. But behind closed doors? Different story. Richard Hale had a reputation among his staff. High turnover. People didn't last long working for him. Not because the pay was bad. The pay was great. But something about the environment, the way he looked at people, the way he spoke to them, when no one important was around, made people quit. And if they didn't quit, they were let go. Quietly, with a check and an NDA. Non-disclosure agreements were practically part of the onboarding process. Sign here. Keep your mouth shut. Move on. And most people did. Because fighting someone like Richard Hale, that's not a fight you win. That's a fight that destroys you. But here's where it gets interesting. Elena and Richard's paths had crossed long before she ever worked for him. Years ago. Decades even. Back when he was nobody. Back when he was just another guy trying to claw his way up. Back when he made decisions that would haunt him later. Decisions that involved a young woman who trusted him, a woman who loved him, a woman who disappeared from his life so completely that it was like she never existed. Except she did exist. And Elena knew her, because that woman, she was Elena's younger sister. Her name was Sophie. And 20 years ago, Sophie Carter was found dead in a motel room 3 states away. Alone, broke, and 7 months pregnant. The official story? Overdose. Accidental. Case closed. But Elena never believed it. Because Sophie didn't do drugs. Sophie was afraid of needles. Sophie had called Elena 2 weeks before she died. Crying, saying she was scared, saying someone powerful was trying to make her go away, and then the line went dead. And Elena never heard from her again. For 20 years, Elena searched for answers. For 20 years, she hit dead ends. Until one day, she saw his face on a magazine cover. Richard Hale, the man her sister had been seeing. The man who'd promised her a future. The man who, according to Sophie's last voicemail, told her to take care of it, or he would. Elena didn't have proof. Not the kind that holds up in court, but she had enough to know. And she decided that if the law wouldn't give her justice, she'd find another way. So she applied for a job, changed her last name, went back to her maiden name, learned his routines, became invisible, and waited. For 6 years she waited. And then, at that party, surrounded by everyone who worshipped him, she made her move. Before we dive deeper, let us know in the comments where you're watching from. We'd love to hear from you. And if you're new here, click on the subscribe button so you never miss any of our upcoming videos. My mom said I can't reach 1,000 subscribers before today ends. Let's prove her wrong. The party was supposed to be the event of the season, a private gala at Richard Hale's estate to celebrate the launch of his new foundation. A foundation, ironically, focused on helping underprivileged women get back on their feet. The guest list was exclusive: senators, judges, business tycoons, a few celebrities. Everyone dressed in designer suits and gowns that cost more than most people make in a year. The staff, Elena included, had been preparing for weeks. Everything had to be perfect. The flowers had to be arranged just right. The champagne had to be chilled to exactly the right temperature. The catering team had to serve each course at precisely the correct moment. Elena worked the floor that night, moving through the crowd with a tray of hors d'oeuvres, her face blank, her movements practiced. No one looked at her. No one ever did. She was part of the scenery, invisible, forgettable, just another servant. But she was watching. She was always watching. Richard was in his element, charming, charismatic. He worked the room like a politician, shaking hands, kissing cheeks, laughing at jokes that weren't funny. At one point, he stood at the center of the ballroom and gave a speech. He talked about responsibility, about giving back, about how fortunate he was and how important it was to help those less fortunate. The crowd applauded. Someone shouted, "Here! Here!" Richard smiled, raised his glass, and took a long sip of whiskey. That's when he saw her. Elena was standing near the kitchen entrance, holding an empty tray. Their eyes met for just a second, and something flickered across his face. Confusion, maybe, or recognition. But then it was gone. He turned back to his guests, laughing at something a governor's wife said. But Elena knew. He'd seen her, really seen her, for the first time in 6 years. And now there was no going back. About an hour later, the mood had loosened. The drinks were flowing. The music was loud. Richard was drunk. Not sloppy drunk, but loose, confident, reckless. He was standing near the bar with a group of men, all of them laughing too hard at something he'd said. That's when Elena walked by with a tray of champagne. One of the men reached for a glass and accidentally bumped her arm. The tray wobbled. Glass tipped. Champagne spilled onto the marble floor. Richard turned, saw the mess, and his face darkened. "Jesus Christ," he muttered. Then louder, so everyone nearby could hear. "You'd think, for what we pay these people, they could manage not to spill drinks like children." The men around him chuckled awkwardly. Elena froze. Her hands trembled. But she didn't say anything. She just knelt down and started cleaning up the glass. "I'm sorry, sir," she said quietly. Richard looked down at her, swirling his drink. "Sorry doesn't cut it, sweetheart. Maybe you're just not cut out for this kind of work. Maybe you should go back to whatever trailer park you crawled out of." The room went quiet. Not dead silent, but quiet enough that people nearby stopped talking. Quiet enough that they all heard it. Quiet enough that they all saw what happened next. Elena stood up slowly. She looked him in the eye, and then, without hesitation, without fear, she slapped him, hard, across the face. The sound echoed. The glass in his hand slipped and shattered on the floor. For a moment, no one moved. No one breathed. Richard just stood there, his hand rising slowly to his cheek, his expression frozen somewhere between shock and rage. Then the guards moved in, 2 of them, big guys, ex-military. They grabbed Elena by the arms and started to drag her toward the exit. But Richard raised his hand. "Wait!" His voice was low, controlled, dangerous. The guards stopped. Everyone in the room was staring now. Richard walked toward Elena, his shoes crunching over broken glass. He stopped inches from her face. "Let her go," he said. The guards hesitated, then released her. Elena stood there, breathing hard, her eyes locked on his. And then Richard did something no one expected. He smiled, not a friendly smile, a cold, knowing smile. "Everyone out," he said. "Now." The guests looked at each other, confused, but no one argued. Within minutes, the ballroom was empty. It was just the 2 of them. And that's when Elena finally spoke. "You remember me now, don't you? What happened in that room after everyone left? No one knows for sure. But what we do know is this. Elena wasn't fired. She wasn't arrested. She wasn't even asked to leave the estate. In fact, the very next morning, she showed up for work, like nothing had happened. The other staff members whispered. They stared. but no one dared ask her about it. And Richard? He acted like it never happened. He went to meetings. He took phone calls. He smiled for the cameras at a charity luncheon 2 days later. But something had changed. People noticed. His assistant said he seemed distracted. His lawyer said he'd started asking questions about old legal cases that had been sealed years ago. And then, about a week after the party, something strange happened. Elena received an envelope. It was left on her locker in the staff quarters. Inside was a check for $2 million. And a note, handwritten. It said, "Take this and disappear. Don't make this harder than it has to be." Elena stared at the check for a long time. $2 million. More money than she'd ever seen in her life. Enough to start over, enough to forget, enough to move on. But she didn't cash it. Instead, she folded it back into the envelope, walked straight to Richard's office, and left it on his desk with a note of her own. "I don't want your money. I want the truth." That's when things started to unravel. Someone, and no one knows who, leaked a story to a local journalist. It wasn't front-page news, just a small piece in the lifestyle section about a disturbance at a private gala. But it was enough. People started digging. Old court records started resurfacing. A lawsuit from 22 years ago. A young woman named Sophie Carter had filed a civil suit against Richard Hale, claiming emotional distress and breach of promise. The case was settled out of court. The terms were sealed. But the paperwork still existed. And once people started looking, they found more. Hospital records, police reports, witness statements that had been buried under layers of legal red tape. Sophie Carter had been found dead in a motel room in Nevada. The coroner ruled it an overdose. But there were inconsistencies. Bruises on her arms that didn't match the official story. A toxicology report that showed levels of a drug she'd never been known to use. And a phone call made from her room the night she died, to Richard Hale's personal cell phone. A call that lasted 4 minutes. A call he denied ever receiving. Now here's where it gets complicated. Elena had spent years trying to get someone, anyone, to reopen the investigation into her sister's death. But every door she knocked on was closed. Every lawyer she spoke to said the same thing. Too much time had passed, not enough evidence, and the man she was accusing? Too powerful, too protected. So she did the only thing she could think of. She got close. She became invisible. She learned his secrets. She waited for the right moment. And when that moment came, she didn't go for his money. She didn't go for his reputation. She went for something much deeper, his guilt. Because here's the thing about people like Richard Hale. They can buy silence. They can bury scandals. They can rewrite history, but they can't bury their own conscience. Not completely. And that slap. That wasn't just anger. That was a message. A message that said, I know who you are. I know what you did. And I'm not afraid of you anymore. Over the next few weeks, the media started paying attention. Not the mainstream outlets, not yet, but the independent journalists, the podcasters, the true crime bloggers. They started connecting the dots. They found other women who'd worked for Richard Hale and left under suspicious circumstances. Women who'd signed NDAs and were too afraid to speak. But now that someone had publicly stood up to him, some of them started to talk. One woman, a former assistant, came forward anonymously and said she'd been harassed for months. Another said she'd been fired after refusing to cover up financial discrepancies. A third said she'd seen Richard in a screaming match with a young woman outside his office late one night, and the next day, that woman was gone. No forwarding address, no explanation, just gone. The pressure started to build. Richard's PR team went into overdrive. They issued statements. They called it a smear campaign. They threatened lawsuits. But for the first time in his life, Richard Hale couldn't control the narrative because Elena wasn't backing down. And the truth? The truth was starting to come out. But here's the twist. Elena wasn't after revenge. Not really. She didn't want him in prison. She didn't want his money. She wanted something much simpler. She wanted him to admit what he'd done. She wanted him to say out loud in front of everyone that he'd hurt her sister, that he'd abandoned her, that he'd lied, that he'd used his power to make her disappear. And she was willing to risk everything to make that happen. So, she hired a lawyer. Not a fancy one, a public defender who'd just gone into private practice and had nothing to lose. And together, they filed a wrongful death lawsuit. Not for money, for the truth, for a public trial, for the chance to finally, after 20 years, get answers. And when Richard Hale got served with the papers, he didn't smile. He didn't threaten. He didn't send another check. For the first time in decades, Richard Hale looked scared. The trial took 8 months to go to court. In that time, Elena's life became a media circus. She was followed by reporters. Her face was on blogs and YouTube channels. People she'd never met had opinions about her. Some called her brave. Some called her a gold digger. Some called her crazy. But she didn't care, because for the first time in 20 years, people were listening. The courtroom was packed on the first day. Richard Hale sat at the defense table in a tailored suit, his face calm, his lawyers surrounding him like a fortress. Elena sat on the other side, alone except for her lawyer, a young woman named Jessica Park, who looked like she was in over her head, but refused to back down. The case was straightforward on paper. Elena was suing Richard Hale for negligence, emotional distress, and wrongful death related to her sister Sophie's death 22 years ago. But what made it explosive was what Elena's lawyer planned to present. Evidence. Not just old police reports and court documents. New evidence. Evidence that had been hidden for decades. Evidence that Richard's legal team had spent millions trying to keep buried. Here's what came out during the trial. Sophie Carter met Richard Hale when she was 23 years old. She was working as a receptionist at a real estate office he was investing in. He was 36, married, and already wealthy. They started an affair. Sophie fell in love. Richard told her he'd leave his wife. He told her they'd start a life together. But when Sophie got pregnant, everything changed. Richard panicked. He told her to get an abortion. She refused. She wanted to keep the baby. She believed he'd do the right thing. But Richard didn't do the right thing. He cut her off, stopped returning her calls. Had his lawyers draft a letter threatening legal action if she ever contacted him again? Sophie spiraled. She lost her job. She couldn't afford rent. She ended up in that motel room, alone, desperate, 7 months pregnant, trying to figure out how to survive. And then she died. The official story was an overdose. But here's what Elena's lawyer revealed in court. Sophie's toxicology report showed a drug called fentanyl, a drug Sophie had no history of using, a drug that, in the concentration found in her system, would have required deliberate administration. And the motel she died in? It was owned by a shell company that traced back, through several layers, to a holding company controlled by Richard Hale. The courtroom went silent. Richard's lawyers objected. They called it speculation. They said there was no direct evidence, but the damage was done. Because even if it wasn't murder, even if it was just negligence, even if Richard hadn't personally done anything, the implication was clear. He'd wanted her gone. He'd made her desperate. And when she'd called him that last time, begging for help, he'd hung up. The defense tried to discredit Elena. They brought up her employment history. They questioned her motives. They suggested she was mentally unstable, that she'd fabricated evidence, that this was all a desperate attempt to extort money from a successful man. But then Elena took the stand, and she told her story. Not with anger, not with tears, just with quiet, unshakable truth. She talked about her sister, about the kind of person Sophie was, about how she used to braid Elena's hair when they were kids, about how she believed in people, even when they didn't deserve it, about how she died alone, in a room that smelled like cigarettes and mildew, clutching a photo of the man who'd promised her everything and given her nothing. And then Elena looked directly at Richard Hale and said, "You didn't pull the trigger, but you killed her anyway." The jury deliberated for 3 days. In the end, they ruled in Elena's favor. Not on all counts. There wasn't enough evidence to prove wrongful death. But they did find Richard Hale liable for emotional distress and negligence. The payout wasn't huge, a few $100,000, but that wasn't the point. The point was the verdict. The point was that for the first time, someone had looked at Richard Hale and said, "You were wrong. You hurt someone. And you can't buy your way out of this." Richard didn't go to prison. He didn't lose his fortune. But he lost something much more valuable. He lost his reputation. The foundation he'd started dissolved. The board members resigned. The politicians who used to take his calls stopped answering. Within 6 months, Richard Hale went from being one of the most respected men in the country to being a cautionary tale. A man who'd climbed to the top and forgotten that the people he stepped on were human beings. And Elena? She went back to her quiet life. She didn't do interviews. She didn't write a book. She didn't try to profit from her pain. She just went home. And for the first time in 20 years, she felt like she could breathe. But here's the final twist. About a year after the trial, Elena received a letter. It was postmarked from a small town in Montana. Inside was a single piece of paper, handwritten. It said, "I'm sorry. I should have done the right thing. I didn't. And I've lived with that every day since. I don't expect forgiveness. I just wanted you to know that you were right. About all of it." It wasn't signed, but Elena knew who it was from. And for the first time since her sister died, she cried. Not because she'd won, but because someone had finally told the truth. So let's talk about what happened next. Because here's the thing about stories like this. They don't end cleanly. They don't tie up in a bow. They just kind of continue. Elena went back to work. Not for Richard, obviously, but she found another job, a smaller house, a quieter family. She didn't make a lot of money, but she didn't need to. She had enough. She had peace. And that was worth more than any settlement check. Richard Hale, on the other hand, tried to rebuild. He stepped down from his company's board. He issued a public apology, carefully worded by lawyers, that didn't admit guilt, but expressed regret for any pain caused. He moved to a different state, started over, tried to rebrand himself as a reformed man who'd learned from his mistakes. Some people bought it, most didn't. And here's the uncomfortable truth. He's still rich. He's still powerful. He still lives in a mansion. He still has connections. Because that's how the world works. Power doesn't disappear just because you do something terrible. It just shifts. It adapts. It finds new ways to protect itself. But here's what did change. Other women started coming forward. Not just about Richard, but about other men like him. Men who thought their money and their power made them untouchable. And for the first time, people started believing them. Not everyone. Not all the time. But enough. Enough that the conversation shifted. Enough that the old playbook, pay them off, silence them, move on, didn't work as well as it used to. And that was because of Elena. Because she refused to be silenced. Because she refused to take the money. Because she stood in that courtroom and said this happened. And it was wrong. And you don't get to pretend it didn't. Now, did Elena get justice? That depends on how you define justice. Her sister is still dead. Richard Hale is still free. The world didn't end. The powerful didn't fall, but something did shift. Something small, but real. And maybe that's enough. Maybe that's all justice ever is. Not revenge, not punishment. Just the truth, finally, being told. I want to ask you something. If you were Elena, what would you have done? Would you have taken the money? Would you have walked away? Would you have spent 6 years planning, waiting, risking everything, just for the chance to tell the truth? And if you were in that courtroom, watching a man who'd destroyed lives with his carelessness, his cruelty, his arrogance, would you have believed her? Or would you have thought she was just another person trying to bring down someone successful? Because here's the thing. It's easy to judge from a distance. It's easy to say what you would or wouldn't do when you're not the one living it. But the reality is, most of us will never be in Elena's position. Most of us will never have to choose between safety and truth, between survival and justice, and maybe that's a privilege. Because Elena didn't have that choice. She'd already lost everything that mattered. So, what did she have left to lose? There's a part of me that wonders if Richard Hale ever really understood what he'd done. Not just to Sophie, but to Elena. To all the women who worked for him and left broken. To all the people who trusted him and were betrayed. I don't think he did. I think, in his mind, he was always the victim. The one being attacked. The one being unfairly targeted. Because that's how people like him survive. They rewrite the story. They make themselves the hero. They convince themselves that the rules don't apply to them because they're special, because they're important, because they've earned the right to be careless with other people's lives. And maybe that's the saddest part of this whole story. Not that he got away with it, but that he never really thought he did anything wrong. But Elena did. Elena knew. And that knowledge, that burden, that truth, is what she carried for 20 years. And when she finally let it go, when she finally stood in that room and slapped him, it wasn't about violence. It wasn't about revenge. It was about release. It was about saying, I see you. I know you. And I refuse to let you pretend anymore. And maybe that's the real power. Not in winning, not in destroying, but in refusing to be silent. in refusing to disappear, in standing up, even when the whole world is watching, and saying, "This is the truth, and you can't take that away from me." So here's my question to you. Was the slap justified? Or did Elena cross a line? Because I know some of you were sitting there thinking she assaulted him. She broke the law. She should have gone through the proper channels. And you're not wrong. But I also know some of you are thinking he destroyed her sister. He walked away. He faced no consequences. And sometimes, when the system fails, people take justice into their own hands. So which is it? Is Elena a hero? Or is she just as bad as the man she was trying to expose? I don't have the answer. I don't think there is one. But I do think this. The slap wasn't the point. The slap was just the moment everyone finally paid attention. And maybe that's what it takes. Maybe that's what it's always taken. Not quiet suffering, not polite requests, but a moment so bold, so shocking, so undeniable that people can't look away. And if that's what it takes to tell the truth, then maybe it was worth it. If this story made you think, if it made you feel something, drop a comment below. Tell me where you're watching from. Tell me what you would have done in Elena's position. And if you're still here, type "I'm still here" in the comments. Because stories like this, they're not easy. They're not comfortable. But they're real. And they matter. And if you want more stories like this, stories where nothing is ever as it seems, hit that subscribe button. Because this is just the beginning. And trust me, the next one, it's even more intense. My mom said I can't reach 1,000 subscribers before today ends. Let's prove her wrong. One slap didn't end her life. It finally gave it back. And maybe, just maybe, that's the only justice some people ever get. The chance to look their demons in the eye and say, "You don't own me anymore. I'm free." And you? You have to live with what you've done forever. Thanks for watching. I'll see you in the next one.